Welcome to the Driving Change podcast on the Evergreen Podcast Network, where we live at the intersection of neuroscience and storytelling. If you love great stories and you love understanding the mindset it takes to be a world-class change agent, then join us as our fascinating guests from all walks of life unpack their unique journeys of perseverance and passion, of expertise and experience, and be inspired to use your own story to drive change. Welcome back to another episode of the Driving Change podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Bloomfield, and as always, we're here to dive deep into the minds and stories of those who are redefining what leading change really looks like in today's world. Now, of course, before we jump in, a quick shout out to our sponsor this season, Brain Trust. That team's over there helping master the art and science of great communication through neuroselling and neuro coaching. If you have a chance, go check them out at braintrustgrowth.com. So let me ask a question. Have you ever found yourself in that moment, whether it's at work or at home or in life, where maybe you knew you needed to speak up, but maybe you didn't? Or maybe you're navigating a tricky relationship dynamic, trying to strike a delicate balance between maybe competition in your mind versus cooperation in your spirit or your soul. Well, today's guest, Dr. Adam Galinsky, has been studying and solving these exact moments his entire career. And I'm excited to have him on because he's one of the most respected voices on leadership, power, influence, negotiation. You might have seen him on his TED Talk. It went viral, How to Speak Up for Yourself, had over 6 million views. Maybe his bestselling book, Friend and Foe, which that's old news. We got some new stuff for you. I'm going to let him share that and breaking news later on in the show on a new book he's promoting. And we also know that Dr. Galinsky has spent his life not just researching these concepts, but he brings them to boardrooms, classrooms, conversations that matter. He's the Vikram S. Pandit Professor of Business at Columbia Business School. His work there has guided leaders at Google, the NBA, the United Nations, and countless other global institutions. So buckle up, because today we're not just talking about influence and leadership. We're going to lift the hood and we're going to get underneath the human side of all that, the emotional intelligence side of all that, and the part that helps us really lead with more clarity and more purpose and more impact, which you all know that have been listening for a while is what we're all about. So with that wind up, Dr. Galinsky, welcome to the Driving Change podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor.
So I forewarned you, and the guests are used to this now because we want to get to know you a little bit. So I forewarned you on that very first question. So take us back. Give us a little bit of your origin story, where you come from, what you're all about, who are your early influencers, and how you ended up where you are.
Yeah, well, I guess the most important origin story for me is that I am a surprise twin. So my parents did not know that they were having twins until the doctor said, I think there's another one up there, and went and pulled me out. So, and they told my dad the second one's breathing, and he was like, "Wait, what?" So I am a twin. I'm also a surprise twin. When I was born, my twin was, more than 50% larger than I was. So he had taken a lot of the nutrients, and so, part of I think my origin is, I've always been playing catch up, right? Like catching up to him, et cetera. The second, I guess, critical thing to know about me is I am an academic progeny, meaning both my parents were professors at UNC Chapel Hill, so Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and my dad was in clinical psych and my mom was in social work. And so I really, got exposed to thinking deeply about the world, doing research, but also, especially as a clinical psychologist, you're applying that research. Social workers are also applying, the research directly to other people. And I think that had a big impact on me. And then I'll just say the third thing is I grew up in maybe the greatest basketball town in the world, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I got to see Michael Jordan play when he was in college, and James Worthy and Brad Doherty and Kenny Smith and Antoine Jameson and Vince Carter and you name it. But there was also an incredible coach named Dean Smith, who I think, was many people considered one of the most, inspiring coaches of all time. John Wooden might have won more than Dean Smith, but I think most people see Dean Smith as being more than just a coach, but an incredible human being who really helped lead social change and create a more inclusive community, in the entire South.
Yeah, those two guys are definitely both two on the Mount Rushmore of college basketball coaches, for sure. So then, just out of curiosity, did your twin brother end up being a professor, or did he go on to do something completely different?
He actually, it's funny thinking about like how people have the same underlying interest, but then communicate or express it differently. He is a documentary filmmaker, and he's had actually multiple films that have been shortlisted for the Academy Award. And I think the way that I would sort of describe it is something happens in the world, and I say that would make a great study to explore, and he says, oh, that would make a great movie to document. And so I think, we both have the same deep curiosity with everything that happens in the world. And I think that deep curiosity has really allowed me to handle a lot of what might have otherwise been painful or traumatic moments in my life by thinking, being sort of curiously thinking about the event in a way that sort of allowed me to have proper psychological distance from it.
So it's interesting because you have, you talk about the nature nurture piece, right? You have a father in clinical psychology and a mother in social work. Talk about the heart and the head.
Yeah.
It's kind of woven into your genetics, so to speak, and you grew up around that. When did you know that you really wanted to go into this as a career? You wanted to be a professor. You wanted to research. What did that look like?
Well, two things. One is, I originally started out, I went to Harvard for undergrad, and I started out as what's called a social studies major, where you study like social, economic, and political theory. And about 3 weeks into the semester, I kept looking at the psychology courses and longing for them. And I called up my parents and I said, would you hate me if I switched to psychology? And they're like, no, we would love it. And I think their lack of encouragement me in that direction, I interpreted as active, disinclination for me to go. They just didn't want to impose psychology on me. So I switched to psychology. But in my head, I'm still thinking, I want to be a clinical psychologist. So I get a job after college doing clinical psych research, and I hate it and actually get fired in less than 3 months from the job. And then I went back, and there's a concept in economics called revealed preferences, right? Where we don't care what people say they want. You just looked at their behavior. And I went back and I had never taken even the introductory abnormal psych class, but I had taken multiple advanced social psych classes. So I eventually realized what I really loved was social psychology and organizational behavior. And so I ended up getting a research assistant with a professor who at the time was the only professor who had half-time appointment psychology, half-time appointment at business school, Harvard Business School, and did a bunch of research and just like fell in love with it, and I'll tell you the study that just blew me away. And he had a multi-million-dollar grant with NASA. And he was looking at errors in cockpit crews. And he was particularly looking at long-haul flights, right? New York to Narita and Tokyo, or LA to, Melbourne, et cetera. And, if you ask people, when do you think these 3-person cockpit crews are more likely to have an error, people will say the end of the flight, right? They're tired, they're impatient, they're complacent. For all these reasons, you would expect the end of the flight to produce more errors. But he found the exact opposite effect. He found there were more errors at the beginning of the flight. And part of what was happening is that the 3 people, when they walked in that cockpit, had never met each other before. So they didn't know how to interact. They didn't know how to coordinate their behavior. And so he coined a phrase called the self-correcting performance unit, that when we start to learn how to work with each other, we correct our errors in real time. We adjust, right? Think about 2 basketball players. The person throws the ball behind, but I adjust and I get it, And so there's more errors that started to happen at the end of the flight, but they were corrected by each other. And that just was like one of these and I think what really interests me about that is a second question, which is, well, how could we help those 3 people in the cockpit who have never met each other before become a self-correcting performance unit even faster, right? How can we accelerate that process? How can we, as leaders, or in my case, as a scientist at the time, try to understand those dynamics so we can actually make everyone safer, and so that's what led me to go get a PhD in psychology and eventually go down the path of teaching at a business school. And I think the reason why I love, I'll just tell you this part of the story, which is I applied to 50 psychology departments and 3 business schools, and I got 0 interviews in psychology departments because it was just hard to find jobs. And I got interviews at both Kellogg at Northwestern and Chicago, which is now called the Booth School of Business. And so kind of the decision was made for me to go down the business school route, but I really, because I'm so interested in taking theory and research and turning it into practice, it was the perfect fit.
Well, they all heard you got fired from that psych job, so they wanted to just push you toward
Yeah,
business.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
so in your experience, because I mean you've written books on this, you studied it, and I love that concept. What is the primary blocker? And we can jump off into, if you want, initially into the idea of cooperation versus competition. Or when you study the brain,
Yep.
I love studying it both from a neuroscientific standpoint, like biologically, but also then the psychology and how
Yep.
the interplay between those. In your research and your work, like what do you think? And we can stick in the realm of leadership if you like for
Yep.
now, because that in the cockpit's a good example, a good jumping off point.
Yep.
What causes that dynamic out of the
Yep.
gate where we might not have that either ability to self-correct
Yep.
early on because we don't know each other? What is it
Yeah.
in human nature that causes that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the theme of my first book, Friend and Foe, was that all of human nature is really driven by this like tension between cooperation and competition. I mean, I'll give you the classic example is being a twin, right? You're constantly competing with each other for attention of your parents, but you're also cooperating all the time. And there's a fascinating finding, which is again one of these mind-blowing findings, is that identical twins, right, the same genetic material, identical twins reared apart are often more similar than identical twins reared together. Now you think, well, you have the same genes and you have the same environment. How can you be less similar than someone with the same genes but different environment? It's because when you're raised together, you're starting to differentiate yourself from each other, right? Through that, like that tension between cooperation and competition. In my case, I ran a 10K race, right? 6.2 miles in 46 minutes when I was 12 years old. So that's pretty good, right? My twin brother ran it in 42. So at some point I just stopped running, right? Because I couldn't compete with him and I went down a different path. And so we see these, amazing events where like twins were apart on opposite coasts and they meet each other the first time. And it turns out they both own a bodybuilding gym, it's just like remarkable, right? And so, you could imagine a different world where, so I think that there's this natural tension, that comes up, the CEO and the COO are often sometimes have that. There's obviously a deference to the CEO to the CEO, but like there's always competition over credit. There's competition over control. But there's also collaboration. And when we have those. Every chapter in the Friend and Foe book ends with finding the right balance. When we have those in balance, right, we really excel. And when we don't have those in balance, we either get exploited, right, or we create a lot of antagonism, right, if we go towards the competition side. And then later in my new book called Inspire, I have the comparison not between cooperation and competition, but between infuriating leaders and inspiring leaders, right? And again, I think similar to the cooperation and competition is there's no person that is inspiring all the time, right? And even the most infuriating person has inspiring elements to them. And so I think one of the things is, how do we find that right balance between cooperation and competition, but how do we design, going back to the self-correcting performance unit, how do we design our worlds so that we're going to be more inspiring as a leader more of the time? And I think that's one of the critical dilemmas that we face.
Yeah, I have so many questions running through my mind now. I'm like, okay, where can we go with this next? Because there's so many different paths we can go. Because this plays in all areas of our lives, right? It doesn't just show up in the boardroom. It shows up on the ball field. It shows up in the bedroom. It shows up in all areas of our lives. And a lot
As
of
a
it's
parent,
probably
right?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of it's wired in, from childhood. There's a lot of programming that's in there that might make you lean towards, for me, I know my personality style and type is I lean toward more competition. It's a top 5 strength for me versus cooperation. But that's because I've got issues that I haven't, from a young age where I had to kind of prove myself. And so even as a leader, I'm always watching because I know that my tendency is to over-index toward command and competition, and even at the expense sometimes of those who I've been tasked with caring for versus just being cooperative. And you can see that happen in your personal relationships, I think, sometimes. So how much do you think in your research have you found, and it doesn't have to be traumatic events, but your upbringing and your environment and the coding plays a part into your natural responsive instincts in these moments as an adult?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, like you said, we all adapt, right, to the hands we're dealt, and we come up with strategies that are going to work for us, right? And And I think that, one of the foundational elements of both, I think, Friend and Foe and my book Inspire is this idea of self-awareness, right? And I think you just mentioned, self-awareness. And I'll give you one sort of great story about the competition cooperation thing is, I met my wife when I was in my, mid 40s and she was in her late 30s. And so we decided, we got married pretty quickly, wanted to have, because we want to have a family. So we got basically married 6 weeks after we got engaged in a 100-person wedding in another state, and after like 2 weeks, we were barely talking to each other. Right? And I finally realized what it was that neither of us had been married. We both had this like a wedding vision dancing in our heads. And there was lots of parts of those wedding visions that were incompatible with each other. And so I sat down with my wife and I said, tell me one thing you really want at the wedding that I'm going to find just ridiculous and absurd, right? And she's like, yeah, I lived in Japan. I want oshibori towels in between the reception ceremony and the reception, scented in jasmine to represent her Filipina heritage. I was like, great. So we bought, 120 of these, little things down in Chinatown and brought them down to North Carolina with us. And I was like, well, I want my twin brother and his high school buddies to play as the band because they like sort of jamming with each other, And so that was a good example where, a marriage is supposed to be a wedding, the most cooperative thing in the world, but like we're still competing over like our interest. And so it was really took my awareness of like, okay, we're frustrated with each other. Like, what is going on here? And I think the exact same thing to like, one of the biggest things that we need to know as a leader, and I think this is maybe the single most important thing we need to know as a leader is we really, really, really matter. And I don't mean that in a narcissistic sense. I mean that in the sense of like, so many offhand things that we do have a big impact. And I actually coined a phrase for this in the New York Times, the leader amplification effect. When we're in a position of leader, there's more eyes on us. Attention, right, is the currency of amplification. So anything we do, any signal we send, even if it's unintentional or we're unaware of it, gets amplified. And then the reactions to us get intensified, right? And so, an offhand constructive comment can be experienced as humiliating criticism that devastates someone when it comes from a leader, right? But also off-the-cuff compliment can become glorious praise, right? When it comes from a leader. Right. And so part of it is understanding that. My favorite example of this as a leader is a guy named Barry Salzberg, who was CEO of Global Deloitte. And after 6 months as CEO, he was wondering like, why are there bananas at every meeting? Like, what's going on? And he went to his assistant and said, why do we have bananas at every meeting? And she said, because you love bananas. He's like, wait, what? And the first meeting he went to, she was like watching his every move. And he just picked up a banana with a little bit of enthusiasm. And she's like, Barry Salzberg loves bananas. I must have bananas at every meeting, and that's just a great example of like, he was on stage and had no idea. And so part of that self-awareness, that awareness when we're feeling, competitive feelings with our spouse for our kids' love, for example. Like sometimes we literally compete with our spouse to like get the attention of our kids, right? Just as kids compete to get the attention of their parents. But that requires self-awareness of that in order to temper it or get a handle on it. Similarly, if we're going to be in a position of leadership, we have to be self-aware of the impact we're having on others.
So then let's talk a little bit about, because what I love the work of Dr. Dan Doherty on our team. He came out of the Goldman tree, right? Richard Boyatzis was his chair in his PhD. So we're ate up with emotional intelligence around here. We talk about it a lot. The self-awareness to the self-management. It's one thing to be self-aware. It's another thing entirely to have the skill to have that emotional regulation. When you studied this and you've researched it, how do you encourage leaders, or anyone for that matter, to recognize what's happening almost at an unconscious level, to bring it forth in the conscious, but then to actually activate on it in a time that actually makes it relevant to the moment, as opposed to, you erupted and missed the moment. Yeah. And I think this is, to me, is one of the biggest challenges.
I mean, I do think two things I'll say about it. The first is that one of the things that my research shows is the power of reflection. right? To reflect on our experiences. And in the book Inspire, each chapter, the first few chapters end with like how to get, there's 3 elements of being inspiring, right? I can talk more about those in a minute, but how do you get into the right mindset for each of those elements? And it requires a reflective exercise. So I think reflection is really important. But the second thing that I think is equally important is what we might call habits or even like structural interventions. And the example that I always give is like, Odysseus wanting to hear the sirens, right? They played the most beautiful music in the Odyssey. And the only way to hear it, that if you heard it, you couldn't help yourself. You'd just jump off your boat and rush to them. But they were terrible monsters that would eat you. And so he tied himself to the mast, so he couldn't do that. And he put earplugs in his sailors, right? And so one of the things that we can do is we can find those interventions that worked for us. So I'll give you one example. I was chair of my department for 6 years. And I was a great chair on many dimensions. And probably one of my failures was I would start talking too much in meetings, right? Because, we both like control, you and I, right? And want to get our point across. And so I had a colleague of mine, if I started texting too much, she would just text me. So I'd hear a buzz and I'd be like, okay, I guess I'm talking too much. I'll sometimes it was just my wife texting me and it, but anyway, you almost needed that mechanism. Another one is like, when doctoral students present research for the first time, I used to be like, that was great. You did this great, this great. Here's 2 things you could do better. And I could see as like putting a pin into a balloon and just seeing them deflate. It's like, right. This was the most momentous experience of presenting their research for the first time publicly. And so I just decided I will train myself to never give constructive comments until like 2 days later. Right? So they can celebrate, they can enjoy. And so that's part of it is what we can do is we can start to build in. One of my favorite examples of this is like the leader speaks last rule in a meeting. Right? If the leader speaks first, they're going to anchor the entire discussion around their perspective. But that might prevent other people from speaking up, right? Which you mentioned that I study, or it might lead them to twist their thoughts to be more consistent with the leader. And if you really care about getting all the information on the table to make the best decision, you need to limit those biases that drive people in only one direction. And we can train ourselves. One of the things the Army does mission debriefs, and they're incredibly important to get an accurate, objective understanding of what happened to help people feel emotionally recalibrated. But third is to make the next mission better. And in order to make sure that people feel comfortable expressing their opinion, they go in civilian clothing, because the bars would just activate hierarchy, And so again, is how do we design our worlds? I have one story which I love, which is that I had a doctoral student who could never communicate effectively with me, but he was a really smart guy. And one day I was like, let's just switch seats. You sit in the professor chair, I'll sit in the student chair. And now he was taller than me. And I always joke as like, he became like the Muhammad Ali of ideas, and so just anything that we can do structurally. I love this book, The Checklist Manifesto, right? And the checklist, because we can't keep everything in our mind all at once. And so we need to, in some ways, delegate to structural solutions or interventions to help us be better.
Yeah, I love that too. And it's funny, we say around here all the time, the number one determining success factor of any individual is their ability to communicate effectively.
Yep.
And I'll die on the hill on it. I think that all of these things, what you're getting at is the communication is the manifestation of what's happening between the ears in these environments, these situations. And as leaders, having those tricks, whether it's a shot collar from somebody texting you that zaps you into verbal submission, or whether you're saying, find out what works for you to put you in a mindset that shifts it from the unconscious to the conscious, because that's going to create the habit formation that will, the Pavlovian response, it'll trigger you in the moment to know, hey, I'm behaving one way, I want to behave another way in this moment, and I need a trigger. That's essentially what you're saying, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way of saying that. Yeah. And I just want to say one thing about communication, which I think is so important, is, let's take giving someone feedback, right? There's so much data out there to suggest that there is, if you really want feedback to have an impact, there's sort of certain ways that you can do that, right? Some of them are very basic, but we forget, right? Focus on the behavior, not the person, right? That's one thing, right, to do. Like it's not like you're a bad speaker or you're a bad person. You could do this to communicate, more effectively. But another one, and this is, I think, is such a great example, is that we often don't frame our feedback in the context of our strategic focus or our values, right? And, I always tell companies this. I was like, if you want people to act in a value consistent manner, then during feedback, you should evaluate their behavior as consistent or inconsistent with the values. Otherwise, the values just don't matter. You right. Do that. And so, but we can actually create a feedback system where we talk about the strategic context, we articulate our values, we talk about the ways that they have acted consistent with our focus, our goals, and those values, but also ways they could do a better job. And sometimes they might have gotten a great outcome, but they took it in a value inconsistent path, and we want them next time to go the value consistent path.
I love that. If Dr. Dan weren't here with me, he'd be jumping through the screen to hug you, because we co-authored neurocoaching, and shared vision and values is such a big, powerful way to be a great leader. And it leads me to this question I have for you on this, because I think we probably share this philosophy. We might have a differing opinion on the dosing here, but what's the dosing amount on feedback versus what we call feed forward? And the way the mind receives, like, here, I'm going to tell you what happened, and whether it was misaligned to values or otherwise, or behaviors, versus, hey, I have some ideas that are going to help you achieve what you're trying to accomplish better the next time you're in this situation. How do you feel about those two, and what's the dosing?
I think that, on average, feed forward is better. I think there's some times where someone has to really understand that their behavior wasn't acceptable, right, to really get that across. But there's a paper that just came out in Management Science, which is one of the top sort of journals in the world, by some just great researchers. And they analyzed basically thousands of feedback reports. And they also did experiments where they manipulated this variable, which I can tell you right now, which is you get actually much better information. Let's say you go to someone and say, I'd love to get some feedback on my leadership, or feedback on my negotiations, or feedback on my communication, right? You're going to actually get more constructive ideas. They're going to help you practice and put these things into practice. If you say to someone, hey, I'd love to get your advice on being. So asking for advice is much more effective than asking for feedback, right? And I think that really speaks to your feed forward idea. When you're asking for someone for advice, you're pointing them to what you can do going forward. And I think that's really one of the most powerful things.
And that's interesting too, because that's coming from the point of view of the person asking for the advice. And I love your insights on, as a manager delivering that advice. I often say when I do keynotes around the country, that the worst question that we've been trained as managers from day one to ask, and we've all asked it a million times, is, hey, are you open to some feedback? And the reason I say that's the worst question is, it activates the amygdala. You fire off fight or flight. And now I'm not, my brain's not built to be open to receive that in a positive light. Now, to your point, you've got to give it. At some point, you've got to give something that might sting a little, but it's how you deliver it. But that idea of as a manager leader, how would you advise we go to give and deliver that? How would you frame that up in a way that makes the brain a little more receptive to the advice from their coach or manager?
I mean, there's so much data, and this isn't true for everyone, but there's this is on average, but pretty strong majority of this is we're much more accepting of constructive feedback when we feel secure, when we feel good about ourselves. So one of the things that research shows is that making people give positive feedback before the constructive feedback, right, is very powerful. Now, some people are like, they hear the positive feedback and they're like, I know you're setting me up to give me the negative feedback, but
the butt sandwich.
The butt sandwich, or crap sandwich, sometimes people call it too, right? But I think that, but it is true. Like, I mean, I know that when I'm feeling good about myself and someone tells me how I could do better, I'm like, yeah, I want to do better, but because I'm starting from a position of strength, right? And so when you're starting from a position of weakness, then you everything is threatening to you. So one of the things, for example, this is a great example. What I've shown in my research is that I wrote a paper called The Vicious Cycle of Insecurity. And so basically what happens is when we're feeling insecure, we are so worried that people don't respect us or see us in a positive light, we kind of hoard credit. We're like, I did this, right? But what I've shown in my research is that it's actually the reason I call it a vicious cycle is it actually lowers our status. So what I've also shown in my research is that when I give credit to people and, someone, compliments me, let's say being on a podcast, like, yeah, but it was really Jeff asking great questions, right? Then if I do that, Jeff, you raise in status, but so do I, right? And right. So I call it expanding the status pie. But when we're insecure, our mind gets warped and we can't see that. And we think that if I give anyone else credit, I'm going to be down the totem pole. And so people are shooting themselves in the foot. And there's nothing more inspiring than having a powerful leader recognize your contributions. And I think that's one of the most important things. And I'll just tell you one story about that. I got to speak in front of the top 100 executives at Fox, including Rupert Murdoch. And I was speaking in the same session with Sir Dave Brailsford. He's knighted by the Queen of England because he took basically cycling in Great Britain from like no medals for a century to the most gold medals, at an Olympics. And then he conquered the Tour de France, winning 5 titles in 6 years. And what he said in this panel that we were on that just blew me away is he said, look, cycling is a team sport, but only one person gets all the glory. So what I had to do is I had to make everyone understand the value of their contributions. So after everything, I would, our person's in the lead, but I'd say, Matt is the one who really helped drive the pace, and then Jeff was the one that blocked that person from doing, a breakaway. And so go through and really recognize how they contribute to the team. He might not even do that publicly, but just everyone sees that they're being recognized for their contributions. And he's like, that's why I won 5 out of 6, Tour de France's, because we were the best team.
Now, do you think that that's something, in his case, I think for a lot of folks, they learn this learned behavior probably through trial and error and a little bit of failure. Yeah. But I'm a firm believer that it's skills, developable skills.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're not taught how to turn our instincts into skills so that we can repeat them. We can recognize them and repeat them in the moment because, we tried this one time, that worked, but I forgot about it. 2 months later, I'm trying something else. And in your experience, how have you helped leaders really, it kind of goes back to those triggering moments, but how do you help them put these into practice so they become not just skills as behaviors, but habits?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. A good example, I'll just mention, I read this great article about Andy Reid of the Kansas City Chiefs. And if you look at the Kansas City Chiefs, they start a lot of games off pretty slowly. Like they're not the best first quarter team by far. And almost the entire first quarter is scripted, right? It doesn't like they're not adjusting. And what Andy's doing in that is he's figuring out their tendencies of the other team. So I'm going to do this.
Right? He's
probing. So then, they were down. If there are 3 Super Bowl victories, they were down 10 points or more in the second half in all 3 of them. I mean, that's incredible. Like, and it's like the one against Philadelphia a couple of years ago, not obviously they got shellacked this last year, but like they had 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter where it was the exact same play. One sent this way, one sent this way. They just realized when the running back came out and they had a wide receiver cutting across, the running back was going to be wide open. So they threw it to him. He walked in. No one was within 10 yards. Then you do it on the other side,
Right.
And so he figured that out. And so I think, that's, I guess, a good example of like, I mentioned the checklist manifesto, like scripting things. Like here's another. So I've studied negotiation for 30 years. And maybe the single greatest form of piece of power that you can have in negotiations is information. Now, how do you get information? You ask questions. Right. And so I tell people, script out the questions you want to ask in a negotiation. Because if you don't do that, you're going to start talking and you're going to reveal information that they're going to take advantage of. Like what you want to do is you want to know exactly what they want so you can offer them what they think they want and still get an amazing deal for yourself. And the only way to do that is to have information, like, they want to go work in Chicago and you want them to work in Chicago, but you say to them, I really want you in San Francisco, but I'll send you to Chicago, but we're going to have to lower the salary. Right. And you did that because you got that information. And so I think scripting out a series of questions and negotiations is one of the best ways to start, because then it keeps you on track.
I think what you're really underscoring there from the Andy Reid example to that is the preparation piece required.
Yep, absolutely.
Great leaders don't just show up and wing it, right? They're thinking strategically ahead. And with Andy's case, he's got a formula. And it may not look like the formula is working, but he's ran this playbook enough to know that if he sticks to his guns, he's going to win more times than he loses. And I think in leaders or anyone who's in negotiating, understanding how to prepare, including, I tell folks this all the time, especially sales professionals, it shocks me how many sales professionals don't script out their questions and then think about the implication of the question emotionally on the mind of the buyer that they might be posing the question to. But let alone leaders, we should do the same thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, here's a great example. When I sold the book Inspire to HarperCollins, I was going in for the interview, and actually it was my idea. I said to my agent, maybe we should practice, go through a dry run. He said, yeah, that's a great idea. So we do it, and I tell him my pitch, and he said, you just told me why you're the best person to write this book, but you haven't told me why anyone would want to read the book. So you're focused on yourself, but you really should be focused on the reader.
Like a salesperson.
Yeah.
Like
I know.
A salesperson.
Yeah. But it was such a good example of doing the practice, right? If we hadn't done the practice, then I would have gone in and just done the worst pitch. Right. He said it's not irrelevant why you're the right person to write the book, but that's the second thing. The first thing is why people need the book, and this is a book that's needed. I'm the best person to write it.
Yes. Lead up to why you're the best person to read it or to write it, because of the problems that it solves for the reader who needs to read it, right? And lead with the reader.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So one of my questions I found with your work was so interesting is that idea. When we go backwards to friend and foe and then come forward to inspire, because I know they kind of one launched into the other, and there's a lot of synergy between the two. I go back to, God rest his soul, I never got him on the show, but Daniel Kahneman and some of him and Tversky's work with prospect theory and all the behavioral economics and the risk of loss stuff and loss aversion. And then you got all the other heuristics that play in part. How much of that is in play all the time for those who are thinking of, am I using cooperation genuinely and authentically, or am I using it as a manipulative tool? Versus I'm using competition, and as a leader, how much competition is too much competition from myself or to put into the team environment? I know those are probably two completely different questions, but maybe we can tackle them one at a time, because they're both very provocative for me on the stuff that you're an expert in.
Yeah, it's a great point. I tell this in the leader amplification chapter in Inspire. My first PhD class I ever took was with Danny Kahneman. And he criticized an idea of mine, and it just crushed me. And so that really.
What an honor now, though, right? It's an honor. You got criticized by Daniel Kahneman.
No, but 6 weeks later in the hallway, without even stopping his gait, he said, "Adam, I love reading your reflection papers. You're a great writer." So it's like these two things. The glorious praise and the humiliating criticism, I experienced from both of them. But I do think that, there's a reason why I love the phrase finding the right balance, right? Because the competition is a great thing when it's done correctly, right? When it motivates people towards the right direction. Here's one thing that I'll just say as leaders, and this is something that I've published. I wrote a scientific paper called Motivated to Misbehave, and it was actually called Moral Utility Theory. Is sort of the scientific phenomenon. But basically, we know from research that any variable that we implement to increase motivation also increases the possibility of unethical behavior.
Say that again. It also increases what?
Unethical behavior or moral behavior. So people cheating, stealing, lying, because what motivation is making the goal more attractive so that people work hard to get it. But then if they find obstacles to getting it, they might go this unethical route in order to do that. So this is something I say to all leaders, right? Which is that like, you can motivate people, you can change incentive structures and do all these things. But if you don't put protective mechanisms in place against unethical behavior, you're very likely going to find that people are going to go down the unethical path, especially if the ethical path seems so difficult or impossible to accomplish. And so I think these things are really important. Like I've shown in my research that Rivalry is amazing. I'll tell you, this is a paper that I talked about in Friend and Foe, and then I did the research afterwards. But it's sort of funny because so I mentioned Carolina and Duke basketball already. And so, Duke won in 92, Carolina won the championship in 93. Carolina won in 2009, Duke won in 2010. Duke won in 2015, Carolina made the finals in 16 and then won in 17. And so I went and studied this in college basketball, but in every professional sport, football, basketball, baseball, hockey. How well your rival did last year predicts how well you'll do the next year. Because you're so motivated by them, right? That competition.
Now, wait a minute. Now, so you've got a statistically significant p-value in this, as that sounds
Absolutely.
like.
Yes. So right, if
amazing. Okay.
if Boston wins the championship, the Yankees are going to do better the next year. But I've also shown in my research that Rivalry also leads to unethical behavior, right? It leads people to cheat,
like sign stealing.
Yeah, exactly. Houston Astros, and then I think, the other thing too about it is, I've also, I haven't shown this, but you mentioned loss framing and Danny Kahneman's work, and being in the domain of loss is incredibly motivating. It also leads to unethical behavior, right? And so I think that's a really, really, really important thing around cooperation, competition, inspire, infuriate, right? Is that we can really push people towards these inspiring pathways towards motivation, towards great outcomes. But there's always that vulnerable underside that we have to, if we ignore that, it could metastasize in the wrong way.
So what was by the way, just to underscore, so we had a little rivalry in our offices because we got one guy who's a Michigan guy. I'm a Buckeye.
Okay.
So proving your point, Michigan won last year, and then this year, Ohio State won the national championship. Now, we didn't cheat to do it per se. We just paid a lot of money in the NIL to do it. That's here nor there.
They paid a lot of money in NIL Ohio State.
That's right. Well, it was within the rules, though.
Yes,
so
of course.
You can't say
absolutely.
That what made you how long was it between Friend and Foe versus Inspire? And what was the gap there that you thought, you know what, there's some new ideas here that I haven't explored deeply enough?
It's about 10 years between the two books. So, 9.5 years. One thing I'll just say, about the Ohio State example, right, is that, people wanted to run the Ohio State coach out of town after he lost to Michigan.
No question. You can't lose to Michigan. You can't lose to Michigan.
But he also coached horribly in that game, Yeah. It was no question. But, to his credit, right, he, didn't act with insecurity, right? He is like, okay, I did these things wrong. Here's how I need to do better. Here's the strength of my team. I need to leverage them more effectively. And then, they were gangbusters, later on. Right. They had to go through, they had to win 4 games, I think, in the playoffs, right, to win the championship.
Against top 10 teams. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, well.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Can I just say one thing about this?
Yeah, please.
Sorry, real quickly.
Yeah.
So, and this actually speaks to just one of the most important things that I've found in my research, is that we often use the word shame and guilt interchangeably. Turns out shame is a really destructive emotion. When we feel ashamed, we either want to run and hide, or we become like a defensive monster, right? But when we feel guilt, then we can sort of build off our mistakes and do better the next time. And so one of the things that I always tell leaders is be accountable and responsible, but don't beat yourself up. Right, accept, but getting back to feedback versus feed forward, right? Move forward. Okay, I did these things wrong. I lost to Michigan. It was horrendous. But here's the 3 things we're going to do so we're not going to face this situation again in the future.
I think that's really important on that topic, because as leaders, we don't use those words a lot. Back even we didn't used to use vulnerability anymore, or before, and now we use it all the time as well. But I've always said that shame and guilt, like guilt is probably more of an emotional. It's almost like a superficial emotional behavioral conviction, whereas shame you inherently feel like your identity. It's an identity thing that you feel like. Almost can't be overcome. It's such a deep wound compared to guilt, which guilt you feel like you can correct, you can self-correct on. It's a really interesting psychological, behavioral, I guess, reflection on, as leaders. If you feel a lot of shame, you probably need to do a little bit different reflection and soul searching, and get somebody else to unpack that with.
Yeah.
Whereas those kind of moments of guilt, maybe there's some conviction there that it's something telling you that you needed to course correct next time to do something better, but it doesn't linger into your identity. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think the key thing is accepting responsibility, but not translating that into like, I'm a bad person, right? I think that, again, behavior versus person, which you talked about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So that's in our limited time left. Let's talk a little bit more about Inspire and what inspired you to write Inspire. Because Friend and Foe covered so much ground. And was really almost it was so much of the stuff that I believe in, but had not looked at it through quite the same angle and lens that you had. So then you got bored and realized you had a lot more to offer. So 9.5 years later, out comes Inspire. It was pretty easy, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think that, I'd started over time teaching this leader class, and more of it came to be about inspiring leadership. And so I just started asking people 2 fundamental questions all over the world. Tens of thousands of people. I asked the people this question on every continent in the world, which is, tell me about a leader that inspired you. And I said, what was it about this person? So I get, traits, like single characteristics, words, attributes. And then I started also asking people, tell me about a leader that infuriated you, right? What was it about them that made your blood boil? I got traits. And then I realized very quickly 3 really important insights. First of all, that the inspiring leader and the fearing leader were kind of mirror images of each other, right? Like optimist versus pessimist, courageous versus cowardly, right? Generous versus selfish, right? The second thing I realized is that everything that people said really could be understood through 3 factors, which I call how we see the world, which is visionary, how we are in the world, like our presence, which is I call the exemplar, and then how we interact or treat people in the world, which I call a mentor. And then the third one is that these really, really are universal. Like they are like a neurological archetype that's in our brain to code our leaders along this fundamental dimension of inspire versus of infuriate. And there's not a single attribute that is mentioned in one country that's not mentioned in every other country in the world, right? And it's amazing. One of the things about finding the right balance, and go back to something you talked about earlier about, commanding and being in control. Like we want our leaders to set the direction and to give us guidance, but we also want them to empower us and to let us figure things out themselves. And so with no direction, there's chaos and people feel lost. But with a vision and guidance, but with responsibility and opportunity, then people feel really like elevated, and I think that's one of the key things. So I just started discovering like there were these elements of that I just mentioned all over the world, and I also said to you earlier, like we can use a reflection activity. So one of the ways that we can become more visionary is to reflect on our values. One of the ways we become a better exemplar is to think about those times when we were our best self, our most confident, in control, powerful self. And then we can think about being a better mentor by really taking the perspective of another person. Like how does this person want to receive feedback, right? And then we can deliver feedback in a way that's going to make it easier for them to handle it.
Do you think it's safe to say, I love that you study this across continents and cultures and that found that this is just a human condition, right? That we're all exposed to in our leaders, that an inspiring leader makes me feel positive and hopeful about the future, my future self. And an infuriating leader makes me feel negative and pessimistic about them.
Yeah.
So in both cases, they're transferring. In one case, they're making me feel good because self-preservation orientation rules the day, right? So it made me feel good about myself. But an infuriating leader is focused probably more on themselves, or they wouldn't probably come across in a way that evokes that kind of negative emotion. Is that fair, or is there some nuance there that I'm missing?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair way of thinking about it, and I think that you know, I'm a metaphor guy, and also I have research showing that leaders who speak in metaphors, are more compelling. I have a paper under review right now where we analyzed 100 years of presidential convention speeches and 100 years of British parliamentary manifestos, and we show that the more visual imagery that are in those predicts who wins the elections. And one of my favorite ones, right, is George W. Bush's 2000. He ends his convention speech talking about Americans live on the sunrise side of the mountain, and that's such an optimistic, vision. But so I describe inspiring as this wellspring of hope and possibility. And I describe infuriation as a seething cauldron of rage and resentment. So we have this wellspring versus cauldron, right, which really captures that and also shows the impact that people have. I open Inspire. The whole book is about an inspiring captain and an infuriating captain and the inspiring captain, it was Southwest Airlines Flight 1380, Tammy Jo Schultz flying from New York to Dallas, and an engine exploded into a hole in her plane. And, the plane needed to descend pretty quickly. They dropped 20,000 feet in, less than 5 minutes. She did an incredible job. But she also did something in that moment that I think really made her an inspirational leader, is she realized if you're a passenger with a hole in your plane and you're descending pretty quickly, 20,000 feet, you probably think you're going to die, right?
Right.
And so
Naturally.
She got on there and she said 10 words. We are not going down. We're going to Philly. And everyone talked about how those 10 words prevented them from having a heart attack, right? And that's a good example. It took perspective taking. It took understanding. It took, in that case, she gave them an optimistic why for what was making sense of their experience. That's an incredibly, incredibly powerful thing that we can do as leaders, is to help people make sense of their experience.
Yeah, so good. And we could go all day on the visual storytelling aspect and the metaphor, and leaders who communicate that way create such a sense of calm and understanding and clarity and connection, and we align to their values faster, and there's so much there. It sounds good in theory, and we know that it does. So give us, as we end, give us three, and you've given us a few, you can summarize if you'd like, but give us three really, really practical takeaways that you would say you could go without a whole lot of thought and do these three things tomorrow as a leader and put them into practice?
I think one of them, here's a good example of research of how do you make whatever you want to communicate, let's say as a leader, and make it more visual. So Drew Carton did this study. I didn't do this study, but thinking about the difference between our mission is to make our customers satisfied versus our mission is to make our customers smile. Now, smile is more visual, right? And so you can really feel and see it, So I think thinking about that, looking towards, the optimistic perspective, right? People like sunshine. They don't like the dark clouds, And then I think the second thing that we can do as leaders is actually practice, and you could do this in many different ways, is being calm, right? Because when we're calm, two things really matter. One is the leader amplification effect. Our emotions are generally contagious, but as leaders, they're really infectious. And so if we're anxious, people around us are going to be anxious. But if we're calm, we're going to make other people calm. But when we're calm, we can see the big picture. What I've shown in my research is that when we're anxious, our attention narrows. I have a paper called, Anxious and Egocentric. Right? We can't see bigger perspectives. But here's the third and final one. There's a guy named Joseph Stigliano. He's president of a bank with 1,200 employees. And he sends a birthday message to every one of his employees. Now, that sounds impossible, right? That's like 5 a day every day of the year, right? But he does it over his cup of coffee. And he showed me the message he sends. It's like, hey, Nancy, happy birthday. How did bowling go this weekend? And then Nancy sends a novel back about bowling, oh my God, bowling, blah, 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 blah. And so I was telling that story, and then I got an email from a CEO of a company. And he said, I actually copied what Joseph did, but I kind of did it in a different way, which is every morning over my cup of coffee, I send one either expression of praise or expression of gratitude to someone in my orbit. I say, hey, what a great podcast you did last week. I was just thinking about that. Or thanks again for your help on the report. I couldn't have submitted it without you. And I love this story because he told me I did it to put a skip in their step. But I get these incredibly effusive responses back that are so excited by my, compliment that it puts a skip in my step. And so the one final thing I would say to every single person out there is elevate other people, recognize other people's contributions. It's going to make their life better, but it's also going to make your life better. You're going to get more status. You're going to make more, have more acolytes, and your world is going to be a smoother place to be.
That's fantastic. Love it. Love every bit of it. Well, this has been great. Where can folks learn more about you and pick up their latest copy of Inspire and maybe book you to speak or just book you to be on their show?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. AdamGalinsky.com is where you can go, and you can get Inspire anywhere, Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, Porchlight. What if you want to get, 1,000 copies, go to Porchlight. But if you just want one copy, you can probably go to Amazon or Barnes and Nobles.
So go to Porchlight. Let's get thousands of copies of this out there, right? Anything right now as we leave that you're super excited about in the upcoming months or even years that you're like, hey, you know what? This is a path I'm going down that maybe people don't know about yet, but I'm really excited about it.
Well, I will say one thing, which is my whole family and I am on sabbatical from Columbia Business School next year, and Columbia is paying my salary, but I'm spending the year in Singapore with my family. And I'm going to be at a business school visiting there. And so I might be working on my next book, but we'll see.
That would be fantastic. Well, it's been an honor to have you on. This is exciting. I learned a lot from you, not just reading your work, but also just having the conversation today, stuff that I'm going to try to put in practice immediately. So thanks again. Love to have you back on sometime.
I would love to come back on, and thanks for the amazing questions.